You ever have that moment when you pour your heart out, when you finally decide to swallow your pride and ask the people closest to you for just a little bit of help, and instead of compassion, instead of even a shred of empathy, all you get is laughter? That moment when your pain becomes a joke to your own family. That was me, standing in my parents' kitchen, trying to keep my voice from shaking as I explained that I needed support, that life had pushed me down harder than I could handle on my own. I had just lost my job, bills were piling up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a backup plan. My friends were either as broke as me or too busy pretending everything was fine in their own lives. And I thought, if anyone will understand, it has to be my mom and dad. But when the words left my mouth, when I asked for a loan just to cover a couple months' rent until I could get back on my feet, they didn't even look at each other before bursting into laughter. My mom leaned back in her chair, her eyes wide with disbelief, saying something like, "Oh, so now you finally learned that life isn't as easy as you thought, and you expect us to fix it for you?" My dad chuckled too, shaking his head and adding, "You've always been the dreamer, the one who wanted shortcuts, but reality is knocking. Maybe it's time you grow up and face it without asking mommy and daddy to hold your hand." Their words cut deeper than anything else, but it was the laughter, the pure dismissal that hit me like a hammer to the chest. I walked out of their house that evening with a smile on my face so they wouldn't see me break, but inside, my heart was shattering into 1,000 sharp pieces. The thing about humiliation, though, is that if you know how to carry it, it can turn into a kind of fire. It doesn't burn you forever, it fuels you. I went back to my tiny apartment, sat on my bed surrounded by overdue bills, and made myself a promise. One day, they would regret laughing. One day, they would see me not as a failure begging for scraps, but as someone who built an empire from nothing. That night, while they probably slept soundly in their comfortable house, I stayed awake with my laptop, searching for answers, searching for opportunities, searching for a way out of the pit I had been thrown into. And in the weeks that followed, I discovered something that would change everything, something that would eventually lead me to stand in front of a mansion with keys in my hand, while my parents stared in stunned silence from their porch next door. After that night, when my parents laughed at me and made me feel like the smallest person alive, I carried their words like a weight tied to my chest. But instead of dragging me to the bottom, it somehow pushed me into survival mode. Every morning, I woke up in my cramped little apartment with the same thought echoing in my mind: they think you're a joke, prove them wrong. At first, I didn't know where to start. I sent out job applications to every place I could think of: restaurants, offices, even retail stores, but rejection emails piled up faster than bills. I would sit at my desk, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen, wondering if maybe my parents were right. Maybe I was nothing but a dreamer, destined to fail. But then something unexpected happened. One night, scrolling endlessly through online forums and videos about people who built businesses from scratch, I stumbled across a story of someone who had started flipping old furniture. They bought broken down chairs, ugly tables, scratched up cabinets, fixed them with some paint, polish, and patience, then sold them for 5 or 10 times what they paid. The idea sounded ridiculous at first. How could I, someone who had never even held a paintbrush since high school, make money from junk? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. People always want their homes to look nice. Not everyone can afford brand new furniture, but everyone wants something that feels unique. And if I could turn something forgotten into something beautiful, maybe I could sell it. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends. Not my parents, especially not my parents. This was going to be my secret rebellion. So, I scraped together the little savings I had left, just a couple $100, and went to a thrift store across town. My heart pounded as I picked out 3 items: a chipped wooden coffee table, a small dresser with broken handles, and a chair that looked like it had survived a war. The cashier gave me a strange look, probably wondering why anyone would buy trash, but I loaded it into the back of a borrowed truck and brought it home. That weekend, my tiny living room became a workshop. I sanded, painted, polished, and worked until my hands blistered. By the end, I had transformed those pieces into something I could hardly believe came from the junk aisle of a thrift store. I took photos, listed them online, and waited. To my surprise, all 3 sold within a week at more than 10 times what I paid. That first sale didn't make me rich, but it lit something inside me that I can't explain. It was the spark I needed. Suddenly, I saw possibilities everywhere: trash on the curb, potential treasure, yard sales, gold mines. And with every sale, my confidence grew. Weeks turned into months, and while my parents still thought I was floundering, I was quietly building a small business in the shadows. I reinvested every dollar, bought better tools, improved my craft, and began to understand what people wanted. Eventually, I moved from selling furniture online to setting up a small booth at local markets. People started recognizing me as the guy with the unique pieces, and before long, I wasn't just scraping by, was saving more money than I ever thought possible. The irony was, while my parents believed I was still the broke kid begging for help, I was learning skills, making connections, and watching my bank account grow. But I kept my secret. I wanted the day of truth to be explosive, undeniable, unforgettable, and deep down, I knew my moment was coming, the day when their laughter would turn into stunned silence. The funny thing about growth is that it sneaks up on you. One day you're counting coins just to buy instant noodles, and the next, you're running numbers on a spreadsheet that actually make you smile. That's how it happened for me. The furniture flipping wasn't just a side hustle anymore, it became a full-blown operation. I learned how to negotiate with people selling off old estates, how to spot hidden gems under layers of dust and grime, and how to turn something ugly into something desirable. But it wasn't just about furniture anymore. The confidence I gained pushed me into new territory. I started reading about real estate at first, just curious, scrolling through listings of rundown houses and imagining what could be done with them. The more I read, the more it made sense. Flipping houses was just like flipping furniture, only bigger. The same principles applied by cheap improv, sell high but with much greater rewards. Of course, the risk was higher too, but I was no longer afraid of risk. I had learned that failure wasn't the end, it was just information. So, I took the leap. With every dollar I had saved, plus a small business loan I fought tooth and nail to secure, I bought my first property. It wasn't glamorous. It was a tiny, neglected house with peeling paint, a broken roof, and neighbors who looked at me like I had lost my mind when they saw me signing papers. I spent weeks working on that house, learning from YouTube tutorials, begging for advice from contractors, and pouring my sweat into every wall I painted and every floorboard I replaced. By the end, I barely recognized it. What had once been a forgotten wreck became a warm, inviting home that someone was proud to buy. When I sold it, the profit wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't the failure my parents thought I was. Proof that laughter could be turned into fuel. That first house flip gave me momentum, and I didn't stop there. Every time I reinvested, I bought something a little bigger, a little riskier. Sometimes it felt like walking a tightrope, balancing on nothing but hope and determination. But each successful sale made the rope steadier under my feet. My parents still had no idea. To them, I was probably still struggling, still the kid who once begged them for help. I kept it that way because I wanted the reveal to be systemic. I wanted them to see, with their own eyes, how wrong they had been. Months rolled into years, and my portfolio grew, from 1 house to 3 to 10. I built relationships with investors, partnered with designers, and before I knew it, I wasn't just flipping houses, I was developing entire properties. There were setbacks, sure, deals that fell through, repairs that cost more than expected, moments when I lay awake at night questioning everything, but through it all, I remembered their laughter, and it pushed me forward like a hand at my back. And then came the day that changed everything, the day I saw the listing for the mansion right next to my parents' house. It was almost poetic, a massive estate, slightly run down but brimming with potential, sitting right there next door to the people who once told me I was a dreamer destined to fail. I stared at that listing for hours, my heart racing. This wasn't just another property, this was destiny, knocking on my door. Buying that mansion wouldn't just be an investment, it would be a statement, a declaration. And as I placed the offer, my hands trembling with both fear and excitement, I knew that the moment I got the keys, my parents' laughter would finally be silenced forever. When the realtor called me back to confirm that my offer on the mansion next door to my parents had been accepted, I swear I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't even process it. I just sat there, phone pressed against my ear, staring at the wall of my office, as if the words hadn't fully registered. But then it hit me. I had just purchased the very mansion that, for years, had stood like a silent monument of success in our neighborhood. The kind of house that people slowed their cars down just to admire. The kind of house my parents had once pointed to when I was a kid and said, That's what real achievement looks like, and now it was mine. Not theirs, not some untouchable figures, but mine. I can't even begin to explain the rush of emotions that flooded me: vindication, excitement, disbelief, and most of all, anticipation for the look on my parents' faces when they realized who their new neighbor was going to be. I didn't tell them right away. Part of me wanted to keep it under wraps until the day I arrived with moving trucks, but another part of me wanted to savor the secret, to prepare myself for the grand reveal. While they went about their daily lives, probably still thinking of me as the child who once begged for help, I was walking through empty ballrooms, standing in vast kitchens, and running my hands over marble counters that I now owned. The mansion wasn't perfect, it needed work, just like every property I had touched before, but this one felt different. Every cracked tile, every faded wall, every broken fixture felt like a personal challenge, a piece of history I was going to rewrite. I threw myself into the project with everything I had. Crews came and went, trucks unloaded materials, and slowly, week by week, the mansion transformed. The dust gave way to polish, the broken pieces replaced by brilliance, until the house no longer looked like a forgotten relic, but a shining beacon of what was possible when you refused to let failure define you. And while I was pouring my energy into bringing that house back to life, I couldn't help but picture my parents glancing out their window, curious about the construction next door, maybe even complaining about the noise, completely unaware that their own child was orchestrating the whole thing. I imagined their laughter from years ago echoing in their heads once the truth came out, twisting into disbelief and regret. I didn't want revenge. Not exactly. I wanted recognition. I wanted them to finally see me, not as the helpless dreamer they mocked, but as someone who had built everything from the ashes of their dismissal. Finally, the day came when the renovations were complete. The mansion gleamed under the sunlight, its windows reflecting the sky like mirrors, its gates polished and proud. The realtor handed me the final set of keys, and I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the house, feeling tears prick my eyes. This wasn't just property. This was the culmination of every sleepless night, every failure turned into fuel, every ounce of determination I had poured into proving that I was worth something. And when I finally moved in, when the trucks pulled up and the workers unloaded my furniture, it was my parents who stood on their porch, arms crossed, watching in confusion. I'll never forget the way my mother tilted her head, whispering something to my father as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then, as I stepped out of the car, dressed sharper than they had ever seen me, holding the keys high in my hand with a smile that said everything without a single word, their jaws literally dropped. My father actually took a step forward, like he needed to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. My mother blinked rapidly, her face flushing with color, as though the laughter she once threw at me was now choking her. And in that moment, standing between their house and mine, I knew that I had won, not by shouting, not by arguing, but by living proof. The silence that followed after my parents saw me step out of the car was almost deafening. For years, they had filled that silence with laughter, mockery, little reminders of how I had once failed when I asked for help. But now, their mouths refused to form words. Their voices caught somewhere between disbelief and denial. I walked up the driveway with measured steps, not fast, not hurried, just steady, like every moment of my life had led to this exact walk. Neighbors began to peek through their curtains, some even coming out of their houses, murmuring to one another. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who had bought the mansion, but my parents had been the last to find out. That irony alone made my chest tighten with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow, because as much as I wanted to celebrate, part of me still wished they had been proud earlier, wished they had been the ones to encourage me, rather than ridicule me. But life doesn't always give us what we want, it gives us what we earn. And I had earned this moment. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain. You bought this place." It wasn't even a question, more like a desperate attempt to process reality. I nodded, letting a small smile curve my lips. "Yes," I said simply. "This is mine now." My mother shook her head, muttering, "But how, you?" And then she stopped herself, because finishing that sentence would mean admitting she had always believed I wasn't capable. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to. The house standing behind me, the keys in my hand, and the look on their faces was enough of a victory. Instead, I invited them inside. Part of me wanted them to refuse, to stay standing in their yard, clinging to the image of me they had built in their minds, but curiosity won. They followed, slowly, cautiously, like they were stepping into another world. And in a way, they were. Their eyes widened at the marble staircase, the gleaming chandeliers, the sprawling rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. I gave them the tours without gloating, explaining the renovations, showing them the details, telling them how every inch of this mansion had been touched by the effort I had poured in. They stayed mostly silent, occasionally exchanging glances, their expressions torn between awe and discomfort. I could see it in their eyes. They were replaying every moment they had dismissed me, every time they had laughed, every time they had called me a dreamer, and realizing how wrong they had been. That realization was heavy. It hung in the air, thicker than the scent of fresh paint and polished wood. And though I stood taller than I ever had in front of them, part of me still longed for their approval, for words of pride that never seemed to come when I needed them most. Instead, my father cleared his throat and said, "You've done well." Just those 3 words, not an apology, not an acknowledgement of their mistakes, but a sliver of recognition. My mother forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and added, "This house is impressive." I wanted more, but I accepted what little they could give, because in truth, I wasn't doing this for their validation anymore. I was doing it for the younger version of me who had walked out of their house humiliated and heartbroken. I was doing it for the nights I had stayed awake, wondering if I would ever make it. I was doing it because I needed to prove, if not to them, then to myself, that I was capable of greatness. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the neighbors had retreated back into their lives, I stood by the window overlooking my parents' home. Their lights were off, and I wondered what they were thinking. Maybe they were proud but too stubborn to say it. Maybe they were embarrassed, ashamed of the way they had treated me. Or maybe they were just confused, unable to reconcile the child they once dismissed with the man who now lived in a mansion next door. Whatever it was, I knew that the story had changed forever. I was no longer the one who asked for help and got laughed at. I was the one who bought the house next door, and nothing could erase that. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Suddenly, I wasn't just another face in the neighborhood. I was the story, the whisper on everyone's lips, the subject of curiosity that no one could resist. People who had barely acknowledged me before now greeted me with wide smiles, asking about the mansion, about my success, about how I had managed to pull off something so extraordinary. Some looked at me with admiration, others with envy, but none could ignore me anymore. Even my parents seemed to walk differently around me, like the ground beneath their feet had shifted and they weren't sure how to stand steady. My father, once so quick to dismiss me as irresponsible, now lingered in conversations longer, asking half questions about my business, trying to mask his curiosity as casual interest. My mother, who had laughed so loudly the day I begged for help, now brought over small gifts, homemade pies, fresh flowers from her garden, excuses to step into the mansion and see more of the world she never imagined I could build. I accepted these gestures with grace, but I never forgot. The laughter still echoed in my memory, even as the reality around me had transformed. At night, when the house was quiet and I wandered its endless halls, I often thought about how fragile life's balance was, how quickly mockery could turn into respect, how easily people could rewrite their opinions when faced with undeniable proof. But beneath the surface of triumph, there was something else too, a deep, gnawing sense of loneliness, because as proud as I was, as vindicated as I felt, I couldn't help but wonder why it had taken a mansion, why it had taken visible, tangible wealth for my parents to even look at me differently. Would they have ever loved me as fiercely if I had never succeeded? Or was their approval something that could only be bought with marble floors and grand staircases? These questions haunted me, even as I smiled in public, even as I played the role of the successful man who had silenced his critics. I knew the answer deep down. It wasn't about them anymore. It had never been about earning their love. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of taking the pain they gave me and forging it into power. Still, the tension lingered. My parents and I began to share dinners, small talks, shallow attempts to bridge the years of distance that had grown between us. They complimented me now, told me how proud they were in passing comments, but the words always felt late, like flowers placed on a grave after the person has already gone. I smiled, I nodded, I let them believe that things were mended, but inside, I knew there would always be a scar. And yet, every time I looked out my window and saw their house smaller, older, quietery, felt a strange sense of balance. I didn't buy the mansion to overshadow them, but I couldn't deny the poetic justice. The child they once mocked now stood taller, not in arrogance, but in undeniable proof that dreams could be built into reality. The laughter they once weaponized against me had been replaced with silence, respect, and even a hint of fear. And as I continued to grow my empire, as opportunities multiplied and doors opened that I had once thought impossible, I realized something even more powerful. My story wasn't just about me and my parents anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, or underestimated. It was about showing that the best revenge isn't anger, isn't shouting back. It's becoming so undeniable that even those who doubted you have no choice but to acknowledge your light, and that, more than the mansion, more than the wealth, was the victory I had been chasing all along. The night everything came full circle was quieter than I expected. No fireworks, no big announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just me, standing on the balcony of my mansion, looking at the house where I had once stood, desperate for help, desperate for my parents to see me. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like tiny diamonds, and the cool air carried with it the faint scent of my mother's flowers from her garden next door. I could see the warm glow of their living room through the curtains, shadows of them, moving inside, their lives still unfolding in the same house they had lived in for decades. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel bitterness watching them. I felt peace, because I realized something I hadn't before, that their laughter had not destroyed me. It had created me. Every mocking word, every dismissive glance, every rejection had pushed me to dig deeper, to find strength I didn't know I had. Without their laughter, maybe I would have settled for mediocrity. Maybe I would have taken an easier path. Maybe I would never have discovered the fire inside me that built this empire. In a strange, almost poetic way, they had given me exactly what I needed by giving me nothing at all. That thought softened something in me. For so long, I had been chasing their approval like a shadow I could never catch. But standing there, with marble under my feet and the night stretching wide around me, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I had already won. I had proven myself, not just to them, but to the world, and most importantly, to the person staring back at me in the mirror every morning. The boy who once walked away from their laughter with tears in his eyes had grown into a man who could stand tall, not because his parents finally saw his worth, but because he finally saw it himself. The mansion was just a symbol, a loud exclamation mark at the end of a long and painful sentence. The real victory was internal. It was in knowing that no matter who doubted me, no matter who mocked me, I had the power to rise. And as I closed my eyes that night, listening to the distant sound of my parents' TV through the quiet air, I whispered to myself the words I had once longed to hear from them. I'm proud of you. Because at the end of the day, that was all that truly mattered. And so, the story that began with laughter ended with silence, but a silence filled not with humiliation, but with respect, growth, and the unshakable truth that the best revenge is not proving others wrong, but proving yourself right. And as I turned to go back inside my mansion, I knew this was just the beginning. The mansion wasn't the end of the story, it was the foundation of a new one, a story where I no longer lived in the shadow of their doubts, but in the light of my own triumph.